still don't know what possessed us to plan a late-season camping trip in southern Illinois, but I guess it started with a simple craving for something different. My name is Lucy Anderson, a restless soul who has always believed that new places hold new possibilities. Living in Chicago can make a person crave open skies and thick forests, and so when the leaves turned golden and the wind picked up a faint chill, my friends and I decided to head down to Shawnee National Forest. It sounds so innocent. 4 friends piling into a Subaru, hauling tents, sleeping bags, and an overabundance of snacks, hoping to savor the last vestiges of autumn before winter locked us away in the city. I was excited to reconnect with nature and leave the bustle behind, even if just for a weekend. Yet the memory of what we encountered out there under those towering trees and rocky bluffs continues to haunt me. I think it always will. My companions were a dear but varied bunch. Mark Dawson, my boyfriend of several years, a high school history teacher with a naturally rational mind that strives to find logic in everything. Ava Robinson, my old college roommate, who is sensitive to energies and can't walk into a room without scanning the emotional vibes as though they were written on the walls. And Jake Morales, an extroverted jokester with a big heart and a tendency to crack jokes at inappropriate moments. We had taken smaller, more contained camping trips before, Indiana Dunes or Starved Rock near Ottawa, that kind of thing. But none of us had ever ventured much farther south in Illinois. Shawnee National Forest sprawls across a large swath of southern Illinois, a place rumored to have secrets hidden in its rocky outcrops, deep ravines, and centuries-old stands of trees. When the idea arose to explore it, I was instantly on board. So was everyone else. Ava, after reading about the spiritual significance of certain areas like Garden of the Gods, insisted we go soon while the weather was still halfway tolerable. Mark wanted to check out the historical sites and look for any signage about indigenous tribal lands. Jake just wanted to roast marshmallows and tell ghost stories, though I suspect he was also excited by the prospect of scaring Ava. We set out early on a Friday morning, the Subaru weighed down with gear. Mark drove because he likes to be in control. Also, he's the only one who can go for hours without complaining about highway monotony. I sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally feeding him snacks and fiddling with the GPS to ensure we didn't miss any turns. Jake and Ava were in the back, comfortably dozing or, in Jake's case, offering comedic commentary on every billboard we passed. Once we cleared the Chicago suburbs and began heading straight south, the land opened up. Flat farmland in every direction, interrupted only by the occasional small town. Ava kept drifting in and out of a light sleep, mumbling about how she felt a pull from the south, as though the land itself was calling to her. Jake teased her gently, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. Mark, meanwhile, ranted about some old article he'd read on the significance of the Ohio River to Native American trade routes, half excited to see real historical sites and half trying to keep us awake with random facts. It took us about 6 hours to reach the general vicinity of Shawnee National Forest. By then, the afternoon sun was dipping low. We passed through small towns like Harrisburg and El Dorado, eventually making our way toward Garden of the Gods. The plan was to camp near the park area the first night, but we still had to find a suitable site. The forest is large, with many campgrounds, both official and off the grid, so the search took longer than we expected. We ended up following a recommendation from some blog post Ava had read, which pointed us toward a less frequented part of the forest near Devil's Backbone Park. I joked that the name alone should have been a red flag, but of course no one listens to the voice of caution when the promise of adventure is in the air. It was dusk by the time we pulled onto a narrow gravel road flanked by tall oaks and hickories. A canopy of leaves, half turned to bronze and gold, created a surreal tunnel. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires seemed to echo ominously. I felt a tiny shiver, though I told myself it was just excitement. The campsite we found was fairly remote, a clearing with a modest fire ring left behind by previous visitors. We were near some steep rock formations, though not quite as dramatic as the ones in the main Garden of the Gods area. Still, the place had that primal forest feel. It was undeniably beautiful, but carried a subtle intimidation. We set up 2 tents. Mark and I would share one, while Ava and Jake shared the other. We arranged our sleeping bags, quickly gathered some firewood, there was plenty of fallen branches around, and started a fire before the last light vanished. I noticed how strangely quiet it felt. No wind rustled the leaves, no crickets hummed. In my limited camping experience, nights in the wilderness tend to be a chorus of nocturnal creatures, but here, It was like stepping into a vacuum. At one point, I turned to Ava and asked if she felt anything unusual. She just nodded, her eyes wide, murmuring that the place felt active in a spiritual sense. Mark, overhearing, rolled his eyes good-naturedly, but didn't offer any quip. Jake tried to lighten the mood with stories about how he once got lost in a wooded park near Aurora when he was 10, but his comedic timing fell a bit flat. The hush of the forest seemed to swallow his voice. When night fully set in, we all gathered around the fire, sipping hot chocolate that Ava had insisted on bringing. Shadows twisted and flickered around us, cast by the dancing flames. We chatted about mundane things, work gossip, what we wanted to do with the rest of the year. But under the surface, I felt an unspoken tension, like all of us were on the edge of our seats, listening for something that might be creeping just beyond the ring of light cast by our fire. Sometime after 9, Mark suggested a short walk to gather more firewood and get a feel for our surroundings. Jake came with us, while Ava stayed behind, claiming she was tired and wanted to meditate before turning in. We left her sitting by the fire, eyes half closed, her posture strangely rigid. Normally, Ava is warm and talkative, but that evening she was more guarded, as though she didn't want to reveal what was going on in her mind. Mark and Jake walked a bit ahead of me, their flashlights bobbing through the undergrowth. The temperature was dropping fast, and a thin layer of fog was creeping along the ground. It was hard to see far. My heart was pounding, though we hadn't encountered anything overtly frightening. Just that unshakable sense that something was watching. Every so often I'd whip my flashlight beam around, convinced I saw a shape at the periphery of my vision, but there was never anything there. At least nothing that stayed in the light long enough for me to verify it. We found enough kindling to last us another hour or two, and just as we turned to head back, Jake froze. I nearly bumped into him. He was aiming his flashlight into the trees, mouth slightly open, like he was about to say something but couldn't form words. I followed his gaze and saw what looked like a pale silhouette between two massive oak trunks. It was there for the briefest moment, and then it vanished behind the bark. I can't describe the shape clearly because it was half obscured, like a torso and elongated limbs, but only for a second. Then the blackness of the forest swallowed it. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice cracking. Mark tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, a reflection of our flashlights on some pale bark, maybe even a deer. But no deer stands upright with spindly limbs that long. Jake wanted to investigate, but Mark insisted we should just go back. We had limited visibility, and the last thing we needed was to stumble around in near darkness chasing illusions, so we left in uneasy silence. Back at camp, Ava was pacing around the fire, arms crossed. The moment she saw us, she demanded to know if we had seen it. She insisted she had felt something circling the campsite while we were gone, as though a presence was sniffing around, trying to gauge our intentions. Mark tried to calm her. He put a hand on her shoulder and said we probably just saw a deer or coyote. Ava stared at him, unblinking for a long moment, then sat down heavily on one of the logs. I dropped the bundle of sticks I'd collected and sank down next to her. Jake, now that we were near the comforting blaze of the fire, recovered his usual bravado and started making jokes again, but I could see he was rattled. None of us slept well that first night. We crawled into our tents around midnight, though I stayed up a bit longer than the others to keep watch over the fire until it died down. Lying in the tent next to Mark, I listened to every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, magnified by my imagination. The night dragged on. My dreams, when they finally came, were filled with fleeting images of pale figures creeping around the edges of my vision, never fully revealing themselves. We woke up to an eerily calm morning. The forest was bathed in a cool light, the kind that heralds late autumn. When I crawled out of the tent, my breath clouded in the air. Ava was already up, crouched near the smoldering fire, stirring it back to life. She looked tired, but determined. Mark emerged, yawning and rubbing his neck, complaining about a stiff back. Jake stumbled out shortly after, eyes half closed, his hair sticking up in odd angles. I took a short walk around our campsite, rubbing my arms against the morning chill. Then I noticed footprints in the soft dirt just beyond our tents. They circled the perimeter of our campsite, like something, or someone, had been walking around us while we slept. The prints were elongated, with a shape that didn't quite match any familiar animal track I knew. At first glance, they might have resembled the rear paws of a large dog, except the spacing and layout were off, and each print seemed to have 5 distinct impressions that extended unnaturally. I showed them to Mark, and he insisted it had to be some sort of trick of the earth, like partial prints overlapping, or maybe a raccoon track distorted by the ground. Jake just stared, silent for once. Ava kept looking around, as though expecting to find the creature that made them standing right behind her. We tried to shake it off. Our plan for the day was to explore Garden of the Gods, do some hiking, maybe take pictures of the scenic rock formations. We packed some snacks, water, and hopped back into the car. On the way, Mark launched into a half-hearted lecture about local Native American legends, talking about how the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and other tribes had once used these lands. He mentioned that the name Devil's Backbone was common in multiple states, often referring to high ridges or rocky outcrops once believed to harbor evil spirits or dangerous supernatural entities. Jake teased him about being a walking encyclopedia, but the tension never really left our group. Ava's eyes kept darting to the tree line whenever we passed a particularly dense section. I tried to focus on the road signs, or the warmth of Mark's hand on mine, anything to keep from replaying the image of those footprints. We reached Garden of the Gods mid-morning. It was breathtaking in the way nature can be. Massive sandstone formations sculpted by eons of wind and water, forming abstract shapes that towered against the sky. Even though we'd come in late October, a few tourists were still around, snapping pictures of the scenic vistas. There was a short trail loop that offered a panoramic view of the region, and we spent a couple of hours hiking it. For a while it felt normal. The mild workout, the crisp air, the shared smiles. It was as if the unease of last night was just a bad dream. Ava even seemed more relaxed, occasionally closing her eyes and breathing in deeply, telling us the energy here was ancient but balanced. We returned to the parking lot around lunchtime, hungry and a bit tired. We sat at a picnic table to enjoy some sandwiches. Jake recounted a silly anecdote from his job as a physical therapist, and we actually laughed. Mark rummaged through the cooler and found a half-melted chocolate bar, which he split with me as a small treat. In that moment, everything felt downright normal, but as we packed up to leave, an older man wandered by. He was wearing a threadbare flannel jacket and a battered baseball cap, his face lined from years in the sun. He gave us a friendly nod, then glanced at our license plate. "You folks come all the way from Chicago?" he asked in a gravelly voice. Mark nodded, smiling politely. "Yes, sir. We're here for a weekend camping trip." The man's gaze shifted from Mark to the rest of us. Then he said, "You be careful out there. Forrest has a way of reminding city folk they're not in charge." He gave a cryptic half smile and ambled away. No one spoke for a moment. Then Jake snorted a short laugh. "Well, that was ominous," he said. Ava looked unsettled. "He felt aware," she muttered. We shrugged it off, though privately I felt a renewed flutter of anxiety. Maybe it was just local folksy wisdom, or maybe he knew something we didn't. Either way, we had planned a second night of camping in a different location, hoping to see more of the forest's interior. I suggested we find a more established campground, but Mark insisted we should stick to the plan. In his eyes, the whole point of the trip was to experience the less traveled corners of Shawnee, not the well-groomed, tourist-heavy spots. Ava was hesitant, but she didn't object. Jake, never wanting to admit fear, cracked a joke about the mysterious flannel prophet, and that was that. We drove farther into the forest, bypassing a handful of official campsites in favor of a more remote area near Little Grand Canyon, another scenic spot. The forest roads grew narrower, and the cell phone reception dropped to nothing. By late afternoon, we found a place to pull off and set up. It wasn't an official campsite, but there was a clearing that had obviously been used by campers before. Char marks on rocks, some cigarette butts. The location offered a partial view of a deep ravine. You could hear water trickling down below, though it was too steep to see the creek without hiking down. Even in daylight, the area felt heavier, as though the trees were older and pressed more closely together. The canopy filtered out a lot of light, so the clearing was dim, with long fingers of shadow creeping out from behind the tree trunks. Mark tried to break the tension by reading bits of a local guidebook he'd picked up. He said something about how the Mississippian cultures once thrived here, building mounds and earthen structures. Jake feigned interest, but I could see him glancing nervously at the tree line. Ava picked at her sleeve and didn't say much. Night descended quicker than before, or at least it felt that way. We got our tents pitched and a fire going without much trouble, but the cool, moist air made the wood smoke heavily, and we all ended up coughing as the breeze shifted. Eventually, the smoke settled, and we sat on our camp chairs in a semicircle, listening to the faint gurgle from the ravine below. I couldn't shake the sense that we were not alone. Like at any moment, someone else might wander into the clearing. Twice I heard faint rustling deeper in the woods, but when I aimed my flashlight, I saw nothing. A raccoon, maybe. Or a deer. That's what I told myself anyway. Jake tried to lighten the mood by telling a silly ghost story he'd heard as a kid in Chicago. Something about a ghostly woman who appears at bus stops, vanishes once you start the car. I forced a laugh. Mark, usually the bastion of skepticism, was oddly quiet, staring into the flames. Ava was the one who finally spoke up. "I can't shake it," she said softly. "I feel like the land is sad or angry. It's hard to describe, but it's like we're trespassing on something we shouldn't." Mark sighed. "These lands are old, Ava. Hundreds of generations have come and gone here. Of course there's a sense of history, but that doesn't mean there's a ghost or monster around every corner." She didn't reply, just stared into the fire with a wounded expression, like she was hearing something none of us could. I offered her a gentle pat on the shoulder, but she barely acknowledged it. We ate a modest dinner of canned soup heated over the fire. None of us had much appetite. After we cleaned up, I walked to the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight down the slope that led into the ravine. There was a faint glow from the moon, filtered through the skeletal branches overhead. The water at the bottom of the ravine glimmered in patches. Standing there, I felt a sudden cold breeze whip past me, strong enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I felt sure someone stood behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw no one. The clearing looked deceptively calm, the silhouettes of my friends illuminated by the fire. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Something felt so terribly wrong. Yet I forced myself to take a deep breath and return to the group, telling myself I was just scaring myself with the memory of last night. We decided to turn in early, though I doubt anyone truly wanted to sleep. This time, we agreed to keep watch. Ava volunteered for the first shift, and Jake said he'd join her. Mark and I crawled into our tent, exhausted, but too anxious to drift off. I lay there, listening to muffled conversation outside, listening for any sign of movement in the forest. Eventually, Mark's breathing slowed, and he fell into a restless sleep, occasionally muttering. My own mind drifted in and out of murky dreams. At some point, I heard Ava whisper screaming my name. I bolted upright, disentangling myself from the sleeping bag. Mark jerked awake. We tumbled out of the tent. In the flickering glow of the dying fire, I saw Ava standing with her flashlight pointed toward the edge of the ravine, her posture rigid, one hand covering her mouth. Jake was right beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide. "We saw something," Ava croaked, hardly able to form the words. It was crouched by that tree." She aimed her flashlight at a twisted oak about 20 yards away. I peered into the darkness and saw nothing but bark. Jake cleared his throat. "Tall, pale, the limbs. It wasn't a person, or at least not a normal one." Mark, sounding half angry, half terrified, demanded, "Where did it go?" Ava shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. "It crawled down the slope. It moved so fast, almost like it was gliding. I could hear its bones crack." I flicked on my own flashlight and walked a couple of steps closer, shining the beam on the trunk of the tree. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure everyone could hear it. The ground near the tree was disturbed, broken twigs, scuffed dirt that might have been footprints, but it was too dark to tell. I took another step and realized the slope was quite steep. If something had gone down there, it would be in the ravine by now. I suddenly felt very exposed, standing on the edge of that slope in the middle of the night, with the knowledge that some impossible creature might be lurking below. The four of us gathered closer, forming a tight circle around the fire. Ava was trembling, and Jake was oddly quiet. Mark grabbed a fresh log and threw it on the embers, making the flames leap up again, illuminating our fearful expressions. We decided, unanimously, that we couldn't just go back to our tents and sleep. One of us suggested packing up and leaving immediately, but the thought of driving these narrow forest roads at night, half awake and panic-stricken, made me hesitate. In the end, we added more wood, sat with our backs to each other, and tried to hold out till dawn. The hours crept by, painfully slow. Every time the fire started to die, we'd rush to toss more logs on it, as though that circle of light was our only protection. My mind raced with questions. What was it exactly? Some kind of spirit tied to the land? A cryptid? A shapeshifter, like the ones from legends out west, but here in Illinois? And why was it appearing to us? Did it want us gone, or did it crave something else? Occasionally, we caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the clearing, the faintest shift of shadows, a low hiss of foliage. At one point, a branch cracked so loudly that Jake nearly jumped into the fire, but we never saw the creature again that night, just flickers of white or gray, suggestions of a twisted figure that vanished whenever we tried to shine a light on it. I thought of the footprints around our tent the previous morning, the cryptic old man at Garden of the Gods, and Ava's persistent sense of dread. She was right. Something was off, something ancient and fierce. At last, the eastern sky began to lighten, ushering in an ashen dawn. The forest that had been so full of menace in the night now looked merely damp and cold. We wasted no time. As soon as it was bright enough to see without flashlights, we began breaking down the tents, stuffing gear haphazardly into the car. Ava's hands shook so badly she dropped the tent stakes more than once, and Jake kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected the pale figure to reappear. Mark, stony-faced, worked in silence, occasionally muttering that we just needed to get out. In under an hour, we were on the road again, heading north, away from the ravine, away from that sense of suffocating dread. The plan was to find some semblance of civilization, maybe a diner or gas station, where we could regroup and decide whether to head all the way back to Chicago or risk one last attempt at a normal camping trip. Jake, in a shaky voice, said something about how we shouldn't let superstition spoil our weekend. Ava glared at him, eyes brimming with tears. Mark gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. We ended up in a small town near Carbondale, though not quite in the city limits. We found a diner that was open early, the kind with checkered floors and stiff vinyl booths. A waitress with a tired smile served us coffee and eggs. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after the nights we'd spent in near total darkness. My mind felt frayed, and my muscles were sore from tension rather than any physical exertion. While we ate, we tentatively discussed what the hell had happened. Mark, in a subdued tone, said he suspected we might be experiencing some mass hysteria, maybe triggered by the local folklore and the eerie environment. Ava bristled at that, insisting that she had physically seen the thing, that it was real. Jake didn't say much, just kept shaking his head, muttering, "Never seen anything like that, man." Me, I sat with my coffee growing cold, replaying every detail in my mind. I remembered the face, if you could call it a face, that I had glimpsed in the night, in a fraction of a second. Hollow eyes, sagging skin, a mouth that hung open just enough to show darkness behind it. Though I'd only caught a flicker, it haunted me more than any scary movie or ghost story ever had. Once our plates were cleared, we left a tip and headed back out into the gray morning. The sky threatened rain. Mark leaned against the car, gazing at his phone. Still no signal. Jake asked whether we should just drive home. Ava wanted nothing more than that. She looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown. But Mark hesitated. What if this is just a fluke, some weird local legend? Could have been some disoriented person or a freak event. We came all this way. His voice trailed off. I understood his frustration. He's the type who needs logical closure. If we left now, we'd be abandoning the trip in near hysteria, with no answers. And part of me felt a niggling sense of defiance. Was I really going to let a few terrifying encounters rob me of my curiosity? Yet fear has a way of overriding pride, and the memory of those footprints and that shape crawling down the slope still made my blood run cold. We finally settled on a compromise. We'd try one last campsite, but it had to be an official campground with amenities and presumably other people around. No more off-the-grid nonsense. Ava grudgingly agreed, though she warned us that if anything happened again, she was done. Mark quietly vowed to keep us safe. Jake simply nodded, looking a bit lost. The next few hours were a blur of driving through the forest roads, scanning for signs that might lead us to a more reputable campground. We found one in the southwestern part of Shawnee, near Cedar Lake. The place had designated campsites, a small visitor center, and even a ranger station, closed for the season, but still. It was a far cry from the lonely clearings we'd chosen before. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw a couple of other cars parked near the campground entrance. Maybe we could at least feel less isolated. We claimed a spot, paid the modest fee, and set about pitching our tents for the third time in as many days. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, giving the late afternoon a fragile warmth. I dared to think maybe we could salvage the trip. I could see Jake's mood lift a bit, and even Ava loosened her shoulders. Mark was determinedly stoic, channeling his stress into practical tasks, unpacking the cooler, organizing the cooking utensils. As evening rolled around, we gathered around a picnic table to prepare dinner. This campground had a communal fire pit, which we decided to use. There were two other groups staying in the vicinity, an older couple with a small RV and a pair of college-aged hikers with a big dog. Seeing other people was reassuring, a reminder that we weren't alone in the wilderness. We made small talk with them, though we didn't mention our prior experiences. I'm sure we all looked a bit ragged, but we laughed it off as being worn out from hiking. Night fell, and we sat by the communal fire pit, listening to the pop of burning logs and the distant hooting of an owl. The older couple turned in early, retreating to the warmth of their RV. The college hikers lingered for a bit, playing softly on a guitar, while their dog dozed by their feet. After a while, they too said goodnight and retreated to their tent. Eventually, it was just the four of us, staring into the embers. Ava kept glancing over her shoulder, scanning the perimeter. Jake chewed on his lip, obviously remembering the events of the previous nights. Mark tried to assure us that, statistically, the odds of anything weird happening here, in a well-used campground with multiple witnesses, was practically nil. I wanted to believe him. Still, a part of me was coiled like a spring. By midnight, the exhaustion was too heavy to ignore. We each crawled into our respective tents, promising each other that if we heard anything strange, we'd wake the others. But the campground was quiet, at least at first. The gentle sound of the wind through the branches, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant chirp of crickets. It was almost lulling me to sleep, and I thought for a moment that maybe all of our terror was behind us. I should have known better. I'm not sure what time it was, but at some point in the night, I stirred from a hazy dream to the sound of children laughing. That was startling, because there were no children at the campground, just the older couple and the two college students. It was a soft, high-pitched giggle, echoing in the darkness. I propped myself up, half convinced I was still dreaming. Mark lay next to me, snoring softly. I nudged him. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred, muttered something, then opened his eyes. The laughter came again, drifting through the campsite like it was carried on a light breeze. Mark's expression changed instantly, from sleepy annoyance to alarm. He sat up, rubbed his eyes. Another giggle. This time it seemed to come from behind our tent. My heart hammered. We unzipped the tent door, stepping out into the chilly night air. The fire pit was just a few yards away, reduced to faintly glowing coals. The other tents around us were silent and still. Jake and Ava must have still been asleep. That's when I saw a small figure dart between two trees on the edge of the campground. It looked like a child, but there was something off about its proportions, the way its limbs moved, almost jerky. I grabbed Mark's arm, nearly clawing at his jacket. Another soft giggle from the opposite side. It was like we were surrounded. Mark leaned toward me, whispered, "This can't be real. Someone's messing with us." But the laughter continued, an eerie chorus of playful yet disembodied voices. I caught a glimpse of another figure, a pale shape that flickered behind a tree trunk. It had the height of a child, but the face was wrong, eyes set too far apart. Or maybe it was just the dim light playing tricks on me. I felt bile rise in my throat. Suddenly, Ava's voice sliced through the darkness, screaming my name. I spun around. She burst out of her tent, with Jake right behind. Ava's eyes were wild. "They're in my head," she cried, pressing her palms to the sides of her skull. "Make it stop!" Jake, wide-eyed, tried to console her, but he looked around frantically, shining his flashlight in all directions. The beams sliced through the night, revealing nothing. Yet the laughter persisted. I heard the scraping of small, bare feet on gravel. My skin crawled. We all bunched together. A shadow flickered at the edge of the flashlight beam. It was childlike but thin, emaciated, the face a warped mockery of a human child's. And then I noticed something truly horrifying. The limbs elongated before my eyes, as though the creature were stretching. The giggle turned into a low, guttural hiss. The figure scampered out of sight. It was too much. Ava was nearly hysterical. Jake was cursing under his breath, making frantic circles with the flashlight. Mark, trying to maintain control, said, "We have to leave now." So we stumbled toward the car, leaving half our equipment behind, unzipping the tent flaps only to grab essentials. Panic flared when we realized the keys were in Mark's coat pocket, which was inside his tent. He rushed back, rummaged blindly. I swear I saw a spindly hand swipe at him from behind the tent, retreating the second I aimed my flashlight. Finally, Mark found the keys, and we sprinted to the parking lot, which was a short walk from the campsites. The laughter followed us, echoing among the trees, sometimes sounding right behind us, sometimes drifting from the far side of the campground. The path felt endless. Our flashlights flickered, or maybe our eyes just couldn't focus from the adrenaline surging. When we reached the car, we tore the doors open and piled in. Mark fumbled with the ignition, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. With trembling hands, he drove us out of the campground, the tires crunching over the gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw a pale shape at the entrance, standing illuminated by the red glow of our brake lights. It raised one impossibly long arm, and I swear it smiled. Then the shape vanished as we rounded the bend, leaving me half convinced I had imagined it. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were nearly out of the forest. By the time we pulled onto a main highway, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. No one spoke for a long time. Jake stared at his lap. Ava leaned her head against the window, eyes closed, tears drying on her cheeks. Mark gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. As for me, I sat in stunned silence, my mind whirling with images of those pale, grinning children, the twisted limbs, the mocking laughter that still echoed in my ears. At a gas station near Marion, we finally paused. Mark refilled the tank while the rest of us huddled by the car, feeling dazed. Ava said something about how the forest was filled with restless spirits, that she'd never set foot there again. Jake mumbled that he just wanted to go home. Mark cast a forlorn glance at the trunk, where we had stuffed what little gear we managed to grab. His rational mind was probably spinning with the impossibility of what we had seen, but no one suggested going back. We got coffee at the gas station, but it tasted like stale water. We were beyond normal exhaustion, having spent multiple nights on edge, never fully sleeping. It felt like the adrenaline was the only thing keeping us upright. We decided unanimously to drive straight home. No more stops, no more detours. Just get back to Chicago, back to the relative safety of civilization. The drive was eerily quiet. There was no laughter, no teasing, not even much conversation about what had happened. We were four people locked in our own heads, replaying scenes that defied easy explanation. Occasionally, Mark would whisper something like, "This can't be real," or Jake would stare out the window and mutter curses under his breath. Ava tried to meditate, shutting her eyes and breathing slowly, but her face never lost that haunted look. By the time we reached the outskirts of Chicago, night was falling again. The city lights provided a strange comfort. Crowded highways, tall buildings, the glow of street lamps. It was so normal, so mundane, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left a piece of ourselves behind in that forest. We dropped Ava off at her apartment first. She said a terse goodbye, refusing to elaborate on what her next steps would be. Jake was next, though he asked if someone could stay the night with him. He looked truly terrified of being alone. Mark offered to come by later, but he wanted to get me home first. Eventually, Mark and I arrived at my apartment. He turned off the engine, and we just sat there in the silence for a moment. I asked, "What do we do now?" He stared straight ahead, his eyes distant. "I don't know," he murmured. "Try to forget?" But forgetting isn't so simple. Over the next few days, we all tried to resume normal life. Work, chores, day-to-day tasks. Yet each of us was plagued by nightmares. Ava confided in me that she couldn't sleep without waking to phantom giggles and the image of that gaunt child thing in her doorway. Jake told Mark he kept feeling the presence of something just behind him every time he turned off the lights. Mark himself tried to dive into research, looking up local legends in an attempt to find a rational explanation. Wendigos, skinwalkers, Pukwudgies from Wampanoag folklore, or some other cryptid from a half-forgotten tradition. But none of it matched perfectly. He found references to spirits of children who died violently, rumored to wander certain forests. There were also stories of shapeshifters that lured travelers off trails. Nothing was conclusive. The haunted look in Mark's eyes told me that his faith in a purely rational world had been shaken. As for me, I couldn't stop replaying that final image. The childlike figure standing at the campground entrance, smiling under the red glow of our brake lights, as though it was marking us, ensuring we'd never truly leave it behind. I became jumpy at night, hearing faint echoes of laughter whenever I passed a dark alley or a tree-lined street. Once, I swore I saw a pale face staring at me through the window of my living room, but when I rushed to look, no one was there. My fear latched onto me in quiet moments, in the space between waking and sleeping, where the mind is vulnerable. Days turned to weeks. We talked less frequently as a group. The events had rattled us so much that even discussing them reawakened too many vivid terrors. Ava talked about going to a spiritual healer. Jake tried therapy but dropped it after a few sessions. Mark immersed himself in his teaching job, rarely bringing up the camping trip at all. It was like each of us was coping separately, trying to make sense of the impossible. One chilly December evening, Mark and I met for dinner. We had drifted apart since the trip, but we still cared deeply for each other. Over the course of the meal, we spoke in hushed tones about everything we'd seen. He confessed that in the nights since, he often dreamed of an ancient figure, part human, part beast, that roamed the land looking for intruders. Sometimes it took the form of children, sometimes the form of a tall, pale humanoid. He said it felt like the land itself was warning us, or punishing us. Tears gathered in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. I took his hand. "We didn't do anything to provoke it," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Maybe our very presence was provocation enough. He shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe we unleashed something in ourselves, some primal fear that's always been there." We left the restaurant and walked a few blocks in silence, the cold wind biting at our faces. Passing under streetlights, we stayed close, as though to ward off the shadows. Before we parted ways, he told me that he might try going back to Shawnee in the spring, purely to see if there was any rational explanation. I stared at him, baffled that he'd even consider returning. Part of me admired his courage. Or maybe it was a stubborn refusal to believe in monsters. But I couldn't bear the thought of setting foot in those woods again, not after what we experienced. I don't know if Mark actually ever went back. He never told me. Our relationship grew distant, though not hostile. It was more like we both carried a secret we couldn't fully share with anyone else, and that secret weighed on us differently, driving a subtle wedge. Months passed. I tried to move on. Life resumed its usual patterns, but the memory never fully left. Occasionally, in the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of a pale silhouette on a busy sidewalk, or hear a faint giggle in a quiet hallway. Each time my heart would stop, and I'd spin around, only to find normal life continuing without me. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, I'd think of that cursed land, those silent nights at Devil's Backbone, the weird footprints, the sight of that elongated, crawling figure. I'd remember how the forest seemed to hush itself whenever it was near, like even the animals held their breath. And I'd recall the final night in that crowded campground, where the presence had taken a new form, a legion of ghostly children mocking us, telling us that safety was an illusion. When I think back, I can almost hear their voices, whispering something about the tragedy etched into the earth. I imagine pioneer families lost to the wilderness, or maybe indigenous children taken from their families centuries ago, wandering in spirit form, twisted by rage and sorrow. Or perhaps it's something older still, a spirit that predates recorded history, wearing the skins of human children to lure us off guard. Whatever it was, it felt like the embodiment of the land's darkest stories, a vengeful echo reminding travelers that they tread on blood-soaked ground. I still wonder if others have encountered these apparitions. Maybe they have, but few people talk openly about such things. Fear of ridicule, or maybe fear that even speaking of it might call it back. Shawnee National Forest is vast, beautiful, and by daylight can feel perfectly benign. But once you enter certain parts, it becomes a realm of half-forgotten nightmares. I learned that firsthand. Sometimes I try to write about the experience, hoping that putting it into words will exorcise the fear from my mind. But every time I try, I recall the tension in Ava's eyes, the trembling in Jake's voice, the cold certainty on Mark's face when he saw that figure slip away down the slope. I can't quite capture the raw terror, the primal knowledge that we are so small and vulnerable compared to the ancient forces that dwell in hidden corners of the wild. There are places where logic fails, where something else reigns, a presence that doesn't care if you're a curious tourist or a devout local. It only cares that you've stepped onto its domain, and once you do, you become part of its story, whether you want to or not. In the end, we fled. We ran from the forest, our hearts pounding, minds spinning with disbelief. But that evil, or spirit, or whatever name you want to give it, didn't need to follow us physically. It had already imprinted itself on our memories. Even now, as I recount everything in as much detail as I can bear, I feel that creeping dread. I see the flash of bone-white skin between the trees, the slow turn of a head that shouldn't move that way. I remember the hush that spread through the forest like a held breath, and I recall the laughter, high, childlike, yet dripping with malice. We thought we were just four friends seeking a bit of outdoor adventure. We ended up crossing paths with something far older and more terrifying than any modern mind should have to contend with. The land, with its deep ravines, towering bluffs, and silent groves, holds secrets as old as time, and some secrets once glimpsed can never be forgotten. If you ask Mark about it, he'll try to rationalize the experience. Ask Ava, she'll talk about restless spirits. Jake will say he's done with camping altogether, preferring hotels from now on. And me? I'll tell you that there are places humans simply aren't meant to go. Because once you see what lurks in those dark corners, you learn that not every forest welcomes wanderers, and sometimes It's best to heed the silent warnings before the old spirits make themselves known. Sometimes, late at night, I close my eyes and see the figure in the rearview mirror, arms outstretched in either a curse or a twisted farewell. And in those moments, I realize the scariest part isn't that we fled, it's that we might have escaped only physically, while a piece of our souls remained behind, ensnared in the labyrinth of ancient sorrow that is Shawnee National Forest. We are left with the creeping knowledge that one day, should we ever let our guard down, the forest might call us back to finish what was started. So each time the wind howls or the woods outside the city go dark, my heart races just a little faster, and I remember how thin the veil between our safe world and that other realm truly is, because once you've looked into the eyes of that land's living nightmares, you can never truly turn away. It stays with you, a shadow at the edge of your vision, a whisper in the night, a reminder of the ancient forces that endure long after humans have laid their maps and built their roads. We fled, but perhaps we'll never really be free, and that is the hardest truth of all.